Hello there, everyone, and welcome to One Idea Away. For those of you that have been following along, you've heard recently we've shifted a little bit of the format, and we're creating a bit more of open conversation, which sometimes brings in a co-host, co-moderator with me. Sometimes that's going to be Jenny Wiley, who you heard from in the last episode, and we may rotate in one or two other voices along the way. And as we've gone into this, there was a previous episode, a previous conversation that came up around how much change is really possible for us in a given year. And I've got to say that this is a conversation. It started with James Garrett, if you want to go back and listen to that episode again. And it's a conversation that has led to some really intriguing discussions along the way and some additional questions that have come up around, if I did have a year, how might I want to focus that? If I really put, my full engagement, my full energy, my full choices into creating something new for myself, or going deeper into myself, or discovering something about myself that I would allow to emerge and realign to and bring out in my career or my relationships or just my way of being. And if I did want to go down that route, if I did really want to be that intentional about creating something new in my life, where do I even begin something like that? Where does it start? How do I figure out what I should even be working on that's going to be most both meaningful and impactful to the journey that I want to take? And so as this conversation has emerged, again, with just various people that I've spoken to, as well as some additional conversations with James, we said, well, why not have this conversation with a microphone again? And so sure enough, myself, James, our co-host again for this one, Jenny Wiley, the three of us decided to sit down. It's actually part of some live casting we're doing. So if you are not part of the One Idea Away community, make sure to, number one, go onto Facebook, look up One Idea Away community. You will see the announcements inside of there, so please join the group. Number two, if you just go to the oneideaaway.com website, you can see about joining our mailing list and getting on the newsletter, where we make these types of announcements about not just the episodes, but also some of the live casting that we're doing. And so for this particular one, the three of us decided to sit down and just see where the conversation took us, so that we could all talk about, if we wanted to create big, deep, meaningful change for ourselves over the course of the next year, how would we do it? How do we know what to work on? And where could we take it? And with that, I'll let you join the conversation.
For those of you who are new to the live cast, my name is Jenny Wiley. I'm the occasional co-host here on the One Idea Away livecast. And I'm also the community director for iPEC, the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching, which everyone can think of as kind of like a sister company that One Idea Away kind of grew out of. So I'm joined today by Luke Iorio, the original host of the One Idea Away podcast. We're branching out. So many of you have heard him before, and he is also the president of iPEC Coaching. And today we're also joined by James Garrett, founder of Brain by Design and lead adventurer behind the Deep Change Project. So I'll be giving him a proper intro in just a few minutes. So Luke sat down with James on the podcast a few months back, and it really sparked a variety of both online and offline conversations. So, we figured, let's get everyone back together again and invite the One Idea Away community in to be able to listen in and participate. So Luke, help us set the stage a little bit here. You and James had that conversation, and it really created an amazing foundation. And so will you frame us up for where we were?
Yeah, I think it was a handful of things. And when, James and I had originally connected, and James, I'd had you on the podcast, it was really because of the background as, Brain by Design. It was some of the brain science into habit change that was so much of what fueled the initial interest. But then as we got into what had become your own personal research project of the Deep Change Project, that really just kind of sparked a lot of our conversation, in the interview, obviously, but also offline. And for everybody listening, what it got me reflecting on was looking back in my own life when I had undertaken various change projects for myself. And I had written an article about one in particular that was a year of mindfulness. But as this kind of evolved and as the conversation developed, it was the intentionality that, James, you brought to what you were doing with the Deep Change Project, combined with the expertise of facilitating and creating that habit of change and adaptation, really. And I know we'll talk about that today, but as that started to take shape, simultaneous to that, there were a lot of conversations that I was having with clients, with coaches, with students, with just friends in my life. that were looking to make some significant changes or transitions for themselves. Some of those transitions might have been external, changing a relationship or a career or some form of focus there. But almost every one of those changes was underpinned by the second part, which is really the internal change that was taking place. And I think that's so much of what your change project embodied. And so as all of these kind of conversations were emerging in different directions, I saw them coalescing around, if we really want to make a substantial and sustainable change in our lives, how do we do it? Because that's where almost all of the conversations ultimately led to. And so that's what is going to frame our conversation for today. And let's just see how it is that we can help everybody and see where this conversation takes us.
Love that. Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation today. So thank you, Luke, and thank you, James, for joining us. Let me give him a proper introduction here, and then we'll dive in. So James Garrett is a brain coach, a brain hacker, and founder of Brain by Design. He's spoken on stages ranging from Harvard to TEDx, and his work has been featured by the New York Times, Fast Company, and Harvard Business Review. He's spent years doing research with some of the best psychologists in the world at Columbia, Tufts, and Yale. He's a content creator and course builder, and his course on the science of coaching has been rated as one of the best courses for coaches and currently certified by the International Coaching Federation, or ICF, for continuing coach education credits. With this unique combination of roles as a scientist, trainer, entrepreneur, in 2019, James launched the Deep Change Project, which is a year-long personal journey to discover what's possible at the outer edges of brain hacking and neuroplasticity. And he also just became a dad for the second time just last week. I don't think that was in his official bio, though, but congratulations, James. And thank you so much for sharing this space with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. So glad to be here.
Wonderful. So out of your primary work, you came up with a question, an idea, like, let's just see what sort of changes are possible within 1 year. So I'd love for you to give everyone a snapshot of that Deep Change Project and, maybe just personally and professionally, what were some of your findings?
Yeah, you bet. So this is a question for me that's very personal. I think it's very easy, or was very easy for me to hide behind the science, to kind of know how neuroplasticity works, know how habit formation works, but not really wanting to show other people how it works in my own life, right? It's more vulnerable. You feel more exposed, I suppose, when you do that. So this was an attempt for me to embody the science, right? To actually live and show what that story looks like, the good, the maybe mixed and not so good versions of it. And just to be more open about what motivates me and what drives me. And again, also to get out of the kind of headiness, I think, of science and academia, and get into the heart, more of the heart kind of part of what we really care about as humans. It's sort of bringing it all together for me. So, and I am very kind of scientifically oriented. So I'm very interested in questions like neuroplasticity. How far can you push neuroplasticity? What is the true potential of the human brain? We have this lovely myth that we only use 10% of our brains. Not true. We use all of our brains, but we actually framed the question wrong, because potential isn't about real estate. It's not about, brain real estate. It's about potential unfolds over time. And so, when you look at the way the mechanisms behind neuroplasticity, what you start seeing is that neuroplasticity is a long game. It's something that you see the real power and even exponential power of neuroplasticity over time. And it's potentially even much, much more powerful than we ever supposed. So that was kind of the overarching kind of motivation. As for what I found in a nutshell, if I can put it in those shorter terms, a few different things, right? One, I found that growth happens in low stress environments. I think this is one of the biggest takeaways that I've really been sitting with. And a lot of the habits that I did build throughout the Deep Change Project were really designed to dial my stress down. I started out the Deep Change Project that way. Effectively, I was working on a different area or trait every 2 months. Mm-hmm. So January and February were from stress to mindfulness. So I was trying to kind of go from kind of stress to calm, or really strengthening the calm kind of system in my body and brain. And then that I intentionally started there because I knew that brains don't grow under conditions of stress. They don't change under conditions of stress. You know, BJ Fogg, who just came out with his book, Tiny Habits, he's been researching small habit or mini habits for about a decade or more. He says, you change when you feel good.
Right.
You don't change when you feel bad.
Mm.
And so a lot of the notions around change we get wrong. You know, we guilt ourselves into change. We're really harsh on ourselves, these types of things. And the research doesn't back it up. You change in conditions much in the way that Carl Rogers in humanistic psychology would suggest, right? You change just like a garden, right? The way you grow a garden, you tend it, you nurture it, you get good soil and just the right amount of light and heat and water, and you cultivate it.
Right.
You don't force it. You don't do these other things. So I think dialing down stress for me was a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love when I watched the previous interview with you, Luke and James, how both of you really expressed the embodiment of that knowledge, even though we have conceptually the insights that we're all learning and, you know, scientifically minded. I lean on people like you who are able to think through those types of things, but it really is in the embodiment and the knowing that actually begins to shift. And so that's really an interesting frame to look at it from someone who I'm very heart-centered, and I experience the world through my feelings and emotions. And so I really love this place where we're coming together and seeing across the pond, so to speak. Yeah.
I actually want to pick up on two of the things. One that Jenny, you just brought up, and then James, that you brought up, that embodiment side of things that you just reconnect us to, Jenny. You know, I think it's interesting. I've joked about this, and it's some of the places I've spoken at, like at the World Happiness Summit, which just happens to be coming up as a great event, by the way. There's so much great research and study and information that is forthcoming right now out of these fields, and particularly out of neuroscience. And at the same time, and I think it's maybe, James, why I was so fascinated by the project you had run, I think every single one of us is a research study of one. Mm-hmm. Right? It's this, it's no matter how great the science gets, that points us in directions, incredibly helpful at pointing us in direction of, right? But we're all unique creatures. And so when we try to embody whatever it is that we happen to be working on and putting that into practice and bringing that into our lives, that's when we learn the nuances of it. That's when we wrestle around with it. It takes on a different meaning. It takes on a different form based on uniquely how we're bringing it through, how we're letting it emerge in ourselves and in our lives. And I think that's where, James, you also just bring up this idea of being within the low stress environment. I've also equated this to safety, feeling safe, right? Mm-hmm. Same general idea. And what you're getting into, to go to the science for a moment, is that this idea of all of a sudden, I think we're paying more attention than ever before to our nervous system. And it seems like we're starting to understand, okay, yes, our brain does certain things, but our brain is only one part of this completely interconnected system. And it's this nervous system that's the central channel that's kind of coordinating all these different things that are going on. And there's inputs coming in from every single direction. And we're starting to pay attention that if we can learn how to downregulate our nervous system, meaning to calm our nervous system, there's so many different parts of us, from our brain to our heart to our different sensitivities, that become more open to different possibilities, more open to what's actually occurring at this moment, being able to be more present in this moment, being able to take in input in a different way that's not getting filtered through, am I safe or not? Mm-hmm. And now we can do different things with it. And so I really appreciate that as kind of the first thing you share there, because I think that is so fundamental to change at this point. It's, you know, I like to talk about change as being, you know, triggered by the foundation of it is with awareness. We need that awareness first. Well, one of those things that we need to be aware of is, where's our nervous system at? Because if our nervous system is fired up, if it's stressed, if it's not feeling safe, then no matter what we're aware of that we want to change, it's not going to sink in, because we're just simply don't have the environment that's ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you describe the N of one, the science. It's as if you're the scientist and the subject of your own experiment.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to say that we are becoming experts in our own experience in a way. And
Mm.
we can compare to each other, but really at the end of the day, each of our experiences are going to be unique and nuanced. And, even the Deep Change project that you built for yourself is not going to be the same for others. So, yeah, it's a very personalized experience.
Well, and it's also the Achilles heel. So when you look at the
Yeah.
way science grows up and knowledge advances, right? All science is
Yeah.
based on averages. So whenever we're looking at an effect in a study or other, we're looking at means, right? We're looking at averages and seeing if some intervention moved the mean. And all of that's great. No, there's nothing wrong with that. Everything's, a lot of my scientist friends are just so brilliant at the work they do.
Yeah.
But one of the Achilles heels and it's a methodological kind of weakness, or sort of just like there's not really a way around this, is individual differences, right? What science has a trickier time doing is predicting individual differences. It can give you probabilities and likelihoods, right? But the thing that it will struggle a little bit more with is individual differences. And I think with the Deep Change Project and with technology is sort of filling that hole a little bit, right? We have these big trends with personalized data, personalized healthcare, personalized brain health. This is in neurotech and neurotech and brain tech. These are the spaces that I'm really passionate about, which are emerging and are filling that gap. They again are starting to give us tailored information about that N of one.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's, and I think this is what sparked, for everybody kind of tuning in today. It's part of what sparked the last conversation that James and I had was, how do we begin to share out an approach, a starting point for people to do this research of one in creating their own deep change project, to James, to use your brand, your terminology around this. And one of the things that fascinated me that you also shared with me offline, and I want to bring that into the conversation, was that it was almost as if there was a lot of things tons of things that you learned over the course of the year. And I want to get to a few of them. But one of the first things you also then shared with me was that it was almost like you were training yourself to have the skill of change. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think that nature of adaptability and agility is something that has become fundamental for the way in which we operate in today's world, at least operate without stressing ourselves out
Right.
over and over and over again, is to have some of that skill, since we're in an ever-changing environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of like a meta skill set, a skill set through which you build other skills.
Yeah.
So behavior change is sort of how I think of it. BJ Fogg would also, again, he's on my brain a lot because I've been really deep in his writing recently, but would think of it very similarly. But this is a new idea, getting good at the skill of change, or the skills, the suite of skills involved in behavior change or habit formation. That's a learnable set of skills that I can get better at, just like I can get better at playing the piano. This is not something we're directly taught, or at least it's not kind of framed that way. And so this is one thing that I was very keen on getting better at. And a lot of the deep change, basically, so every 2 months, again, I was working on these 6 different traits. The 6 traits were mindfulness, focus, positivity, creativity, courage, and love. So those were the 6. And the basic framework was, I was trying to move from kind of a 1.0 default setting, which I think the brain comes with a lot of these, like a negativity bias. I was trying to upgrade that to a 2.0 positivity bias. So I had this kind of overarching framework for this. But I think And what kind of anchored each of those 2 months was I was building a stack of 3 new habits every 2 months. And in the process of doing that, of being kind of deep in the trenches of building these habits and sustaining them and starting them and sustaining the old ones and starting new ones on top of it, and the triggers and the anchors and all this habit stacking and all this cool literature we know about habits now. What I started realizing is, well, it was about August. And I'll just drop you into a moment. It was literally like 11:30 p.m. My house was quiet. Everybody was in bed. And I had just finished the last habit. I think at this point I was doing 12 habits a day. And I text my friend Scott, who's my accountability partner. I have that's part of my system, as I'm always reporting to someone, texting them every day, telling them I did or didn't do my habits. And it was like this flood of confidence. Psychologists call this self-efficacy. This sense of belief that I can, because there was so much evidence. I'd accumulated all this evidence of these small wins, right? These daily habits. And I had this, I keep them in a calendar system. Yeah. So it's all visual. So I divide every calendar into 4 squares, and then each habit is, it corresponds to 3 of the squares, and the 4th habit is my accountability partner. So every day I'm making all these X's I have a whole wall of these calendars, right? Yeah. So my brain is literally seeing all that visual progress. I can't deny it. And suddenly it's like a light switch goes on, and my brain goes, "You're good at this." Look, right? Like this is a skill, like you can. And suddenly it was I almost describe it as like it was a euphoric experience, right? I had this sense that limitations, or the sense of limitations, the sort of self-imposed limitations, were just that, right? Self-imposed, that the kind of slightly anxious, trending toward negativity kind of tendencies our brains have are these kind of filters that aren't really telling us the truth. They're just there to designed to keep us safe, but they have nothing to do with our potential. Right. They have nothing to do with what we're capable of. They have nothing to do with what we can become over time. And so it was like I saw that clearly, and it was as if my brain was saying to itself, anytime this comes up, like a self-defeating thought or a limiting belief or whatever that is, you can't. Now you know better. Right? You know that that's just your brain doing its kind of monkey mind thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm just really curious, and that it's one of those things that every once in a while that, it's kind of like an attorney in a courtroom. You never ask a question unless you know the answer you're going to get. I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm just curious where this goes. When you had that moment that you looked at the board of everything that was complete, and you get that knowing of, wow, I'm good at this. I really know how to make change and bring that into my life.
Yeah.
Did you know that with your mind, or did you know it with your heart?
I knew it with my soul. It was like my body, right? It was in my bones. Yeah. It's like knowledge by acquaintance, which is very different than knowledge by description, right? It was knowing it through being it, through living it, through grappling with it, with wrestling with it, and going through all of that, and then coming out the struggle, because it's hard, right? Yeah. Coming through the struggle and seeing that you can do it. Mm-hmm. It's the combination of those things that then it's like your brain is smart. Your brains are smart in this way. You can't really trick them into. It's hard to trick the brain, I think, into kind of false states of confidence. Mm-hmm. Brains kind of know that deeper confidence, and we know it when we see it in other people. We're like, there's something in that person that I know they've achieved that or something. We can sense that, right? And so our brains, I think, are attuned to this, and so that it's a visceral thing. It's very much a body thing.
Yeah, yeah. I loved dropping into that moment with you just now. That was visceral for me too, and very inspiring for me to hear you recollect and be in that moment of awareness and embodiment of that experience for yourself. I mean, even just you sharing that is changing things. Luke, I want to come back to you because you were really inspired by a variety of things. One of them I know was James's conversation, with him about how you're doing your own personal change project. And so I would love for you to share what's going on in your world with that right now.
So, as I, briefly mentioned, I started after our conversation, James, I went back and kind of looked at some of the things that I had done in my own life, and I reflected on that year of mindfulness that I'd had. And it was nowhere near as for, everybody listening, it was not as intentional as what James has laid out. And I did not have, certainly.
You didn't have a bunch of X's on the wall?
I did not have, I was not at that level. I didn't have the experience.
That's very mindful of you.
It's funny because as you're describing that, I have one of those apps on my phone that gives me the calendar that checks everything off. It's addictive. It's like, I've got to fill in all the circles.
Don't break the pattern.
So I encourage everybody to, a separate note, everybody check out habit stacking, check out all the things that James is talking about. We'll give out some resources later.
Sure.
Anyhow, when I started to reflect back on the year that I had, I recognized how substantial the shifts were in about a 10-month period of very, very intentional learning and experience that I put myself through. And mindfulness happened to be the vehicle for me in that particular period of time. It still is. It's still a very important part of my own personal practice. And so as this conversation emerged, there was something already in the back of my mind, but I didn't really know where it was going or why it was surfacing the way that it was. And as I put in that article, which needless to say, James, you were very quick to pick up on and email me about or message me about, was that the coming year, and I'm beginning this shortly. I'm still in kind of the final stages of how I want to focus all of this. But the coming year is really going to be all about how is it that I allow myself, and I use that language very, very specifically, and I'll explain that for a moment. How do I allow myself to love and be loved? And because I began to recognize when I went through my year with mindfulness and how this started to come back around for me, was that one of the things I wanted, this is a little roundabout, but the thing that I actually wanted to initially improve in my life was that feeling of presence. And I knew to be more present in the moment, part of that was calming my mind and dropping, kind of down regulating my nervous system, as we were chatting about. But as I became more aware of what was occurring in the present, I recognized that one of my greatest obstacles to being present wasn't a lack of focus. It was a lack of compassion. It was a lack of compassion for myself. And it was very often a lack of compassion for the individuals that I might have been involved in a given circumstance with. And when you have a lack of compassion, that can lead to judgment. It can lead to various interpretations that do not serve you, that are not accurate to what is unfolding at those times. And this kind of cascade of insight that started to flow from that. And so as I started to think about where I wanted to evolve things now, it was that idea of allowing myself to love as well as to be loved. And because I feel that that's part of my next evolution. The next part of it is why I use that language of allow. I think that, at least in my experience of what I have found for myself to be true, is that so much of this is already really, truly core to who we are as human beings. And it's the layers that we have on top that seem to guide us away from it, because we think we should. We expect it to be this way. We have a role to play or a mask that we should be wearing. And so allowing, to me, it relates to actually a lot of traits that you were mentioning, James, of courage, vulnerability, honesty with self about what I'm feeling at any given time. And then learning how to not just lean into that, but how to express that inwardly, meaning how to have that inward dialogue of understanding what I'm going through, because allowing myself to love and be loved actually begins quite literally internally, and leaning into that side of it And then how is it that I bring that out through my decisions and through my words and through my actions, which affect the people that are around me. And so I'm still in the midst of heading down this road and designing this project. We can talk about it a bit more in that sense too, but that's sort of the basis of how I've gotten there. And I actually, this will turn around to actually the question, James, to you in a moment, is that the way that I've gotten there is because of past experiences and, for lack of a better term, surveying a lot of different, dabbling with, perhaps is a better word, a lot of different areas that I may want to upgrade in my life. And through that surveying or that experimenting, that dabbling, it became very clear to me, this is what's calling to you right now, and this is what would most serve you right now. And James, that's kind of what I wanted to certainly comment on anything that I brought up that might have triggered any thoughts for you. But it's also the question I had for you is, how your own project is evolving, because I know that it's evolving into a new change project or a new focus for this coming year. And I was wondering if you could just share about how that transpired, how that unfolded for you to know what this year now looks like for you.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting. Again, thinking about the thesis that I was working with is Richard Davidson's thesis of altered traits. So Richie Davidson, very well-known researcher in mindfulness and neuroscience at University of Wisconsin, was really the one instrumental in sort of combining kind of, early days, finally studying lifelong meditators, monks, connecting ultimately over time with the Dalai Lama and other things. But his what they're finding in some of that research is the kind of these outer edges of neuroplasticity, that you can not only change how you feel or a state, but you can actually change your new default setting. You can actually change traits. And so this is underlying kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing, and in the order I'm doing what I'm doing. This is how I'm thinking. There's actually a great book called Altered Traits by Richie Davidson and Daniel Goleman. Yeah. And I was trying to do one every 2 months, largely because of the kind of, window of neuroplasticity. It takes around 66 days to form a new habit. So I'm using that as kind of like a rule of thumb for kind of a stabilizing neuroplasticity change. And as I'm going through the year, I'm having kind of the experience that you're having, Luke, which is there are these areas that I feel somehow, for whatever reason, more drawn to in this moment in my life. Fear and courage was the big one. This was the one, and this was September and October, and it just blew my mind.
Interesting.
And I kind of knew it somewhere, but I didn't know it until I was in it, how interesting it was to me and how hard it was for me. But these are the 2 months when I started doing crazy stuff. I mean, I jumped out of an airplane, right? I learned how to surf, which is, I've always been kind of nervous about surfing. I meditated in this sort of crowded walkway with like people walking all around me. And I'm sitting there with like my Muse headband, just like zenning out, right? All of that stuff, right? And I think but the real heart of it was I was doing something that scared me every day. Yeah. And trying to intentionally walk into situations where I'd face things like social rejection. I mean, I think our deepest fears are social and relational. We fear being judged. We fear failure. Why do we feel failure? Because we think other people make fun of us or look down on us. We fear rejection. Fear of rejection, I know for me, is one of my biggest. Yeah. And so I started realizing, there's a little bit more here than I maybe bargained for. This could take a little longer than 2 months. So I've unpacked this a little bit more, and that's right. So this year now in 2020, I'm working just on fear and courage. So it originally kind of evolved. I was a little more maybe ambitious in the beginning, where I was like, I want to see if I can erase fear from my brain. That was kind of the framework. And I still think it's an interesting hypothesis, and I'm still testing it. But I think the more sort of kind of universally, relatable framework is something more like, I want to feel the fear and do it anyways. I don't want fear to stop me.
Right.
I want, if it's like an if-then plan. If I feel fear, then I take action.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us, in the way we're wired neurologically, is that if I feel fear, then I freeze. That's the first response in fear. Joseph Ledoux has shown this that the fight or flight response is really fight, flight, or freeze, but freeze is the first thing. It has an order. If we feel fear or anxiety, we freeze first, then we flee, then last we fight, if we have to. But freezing is absolutely the first thing we do. And so fear is the biggest impediment, in my view, to human progress, to our own progress, to our own growth and development. It always freezes us. And anxiety, physiologically, is the exact same emotion as fear. So they're not physically different emotions. They're exact same emotions. What's different is context. Yeah. Fear is something that's imminent. It's something that's, there's a snake right at your feet. There's something right there. Anxiety is future oriented. So fear is present oriented. Anxiety is future oriented. I'm worried about paying my mortgage at the end of the month. But the actual feeling is the same. So it has the same effect. And that effect is to literally stop us from becoming these 2.0 better versions of ourselves. And so again, fear has served, I think, a wise purpose in the long history of humanity. But the challenge I think we face collectively is that it's not really serving that purpose anymore. It's not, of course, at times it keeps us safe, but the world, contrary to what you see in the news, is safer than it's ever been in the history of humanity. Steven Pinker has shown this pretty emphatically, in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature. If you look at the data, we're looking at we're in the most secure globally. And of course, there's always pockets that where this is not the case. Sure. But it is the safest time in human history. It's for sure the best time to be alive. The threat of violence is just so low compared to what it's been in the past. And so fear, again, served us well, but it's really now just serving to hold us back. Yeah. And for me, this is a major problem. Yeah. It's almost like our brains hijack our potential, keep us small in the name of safety, right, but end up having a different agenda. It's like your brain has its own logic. Mm-hmm. You've got to understand the operating system. Your brain doesn't come with a user's manual. You've got to kind of figure that out. And so the brain and neuroscience is sort of finally giving us a user's manual saying, this is what your brain's up to. It has its own priorities. Those priorities might look different than yours. And so to rewire fear, so if I feel fear, then I take action instead of freeze, I think is a massive shift. And it's something that I think is completely trainable.
Right.
A couple, actually, Jenny, if you don't mind, I want a couple comments on that, because it triggered so many things. One, and I wish I could give you the very specific science reference, James, you may know it, was the work that's been done and the research that's shown that the idea of social pain, the relational fear that you're talking about, actually triggers the same response as physical trauma does inside of our brains. And it's because we are so wired into that social aspect of who we are as beings. And then the comments you're making specifically around fear, when we relate it to the very first comment that you talked about of being in a low stress environment, right? So if we find ways of changing our relationship to fear, then we find more environments that we don't perceive as high stress, because we can perceive them very, very differently. And we're not caught up in the emotional, social fears that are significantly more prevalent in society at this point than imminent threat and violence and that kind of fear that can get triggered. And so there, I can see what you're describing as this incredible cascade effect. I see it as kind of part and parcel to what I'm looking at with my own project, and why I shared it from that standpoint is I do believe that some of the things I'm working on are innate to who we are, but what is it that stops us? It's that fear of uncertainty, fear of vulnerability, fear of looking like a fool or being embarrassed or whatever the case may be. It's a fear, and a lot of those are either they're social fears is a huge piece of that. And even some of the fears that may not necessarily be social are still about your relationship to yourself. So in some ways they're still relational.
Right.
And so, there's an incredible foundation there. And I do want to talk about, and I, Jenny, I do want to guide us over to kind of how we do this, meaning like, where does somebody start if they're thinking about this? But I think what we've talked about so far, and I think it's so crucial, James, to what you're bringing up, is understanding the importance in any change project of doing the things that help you create a lower stress environment and doing the things that enable to change your relationship to fear, because that is fundamental to the success of the change that you are undertaking.
Yeah. I'm even visualizing, as we're talking about this, the concept of fear and the embodiment of it being either, a gate that's closed that you're going to walk away from, or an open space that you're going to open the door to and walk through and use that as fuel to help move you forward. And it creates, it's created through flexibility and compassion for yourself and creating boundaries and aligning with what values are important to you. Both of you have described how you just knew, you had a sense of what you knew you needed to move more towards. And it was that real tapping into, what am I aligning with? What is really important to me? What do I know I'm moving away from, but I really need to be moving towards? And that openness, it's really exciting to dive into. Yeah. So I'm a mom of two. I'm a coach. I work for a great coach training program. And when I think about an experiment like what you guys are doing, I'm like, nope, shut it down. This sounds way too big. I don't even know where I would start with this. I might be able to draw some X's, but I really just don't even know where I would start. And I do have, my own practices that I do around being open and emptying myself to be in the experience and being present and everything. But I don't know how I would even start. And so I would love to have both of you weigh in on that. If somebody like me, or anyone else who's watching and tuning in, wants to create that kind of change in their life and potentially design a project like this, where do we start?
It's a great question. And it's something that for me, I feel like over the last year of doing my first version of it, I've learned a lot. One of the things that I think I've learned is the approach is like, it's like more like a sandbox. You're playing, you're experimenting, you want to think of it as like a change lab. You're playing around with what works to change you into this better version of yourself. And I think keeping it light and playful in that way helps enormously. And that really is kind of just a paradigm or a sort of framework. It's a bit of a mental attitude or something. But I get what you're saying about the overwhelming piece, and I want to address that.
Sure.
What's interesting about the way I started the project last year is it started very small. It's really just 3 habits. Reading, exercise, and meditation. It was just my morning routine. It's kind of boring in a sense. Habits usually are. That's why they're so powerful, is because you can stick to them. They have these incredible results, but they're a little bit boring. You got to get through the boring part.
Yeah.
And then it was like, it was all incremental. I didn't really overthink it. And I'm not overthinking the fear project this year, or the courage project. I'm feeling my way through it. And I think that matters, right? Because I think we have this idea that I've got to have it all set up. I've got to have like everything all kind of put together before I start. And I do think that's a mistake we get, or a mental trap we get caught in. That said, I do think it's helpful to create a bit of a framework. And what I'm finding for me is that what works is you've got to have things that anchor the process. And I think there's like these levers of neuroplasticity that you want to be pulling, right? the big one is habits. Neurons are a technology that turn experience into biology. And so what you want to, I'm iterating a little bit on a quote from Jason Silva, and I'm actually not sure where he gets that quote, but it's a beautiful quote. It's very poetic, right? Neurons are a technology that turn experience into biology. So when you start doing a certain behavior, when you design a certain behavior in a certain way, you can, and again, we think of habits usually as health promoting, exercise, meditation, maybe a reading habit, these types of things. What you're actually doing is the circuits in the brain, the physical stuff in the brain that's responsible for those particular behaviors. Because you keep doing it, your brain's like, wow, we need to strengthen those pathways. And it actually starts investing neural resources, myelin sheath. It starts investing in, dendritic growth, recruiting new neurons to the area, because it just needs, it's use-dependent plasticity. Whether or not it gets stronger depends on whether you use it. Another great quote from Donald Hebb is, neurons that fire together wire together. So you start strengthening these areas of the brain, which are like these little muscles, right? In a sense, it's like our brain is like a muscle. As you use certain parts of it, it gets stronger. Now, again, one of the biggest leverage of ways to do that is what you do. Your brain doesn't care who you are. This is Daniel Coyle in his book, The Talent Code. The brain doesn't care who you are. It only cares what you do.
Yeah.
I love that idea.
Right.
And it responds to what you do based on this kind of feedback loop by strengthening what you do so that it's easier next time. That's the whole goal for the brain. Yeah. Brain just wants to use less energy. Doesn't want to use as much energy. It's an energy Scrooge. So it parses it out very miserly. But if you're gonna keep doing this thing, it's gonna make it easier for itself to do it.
Right.
And so you want to leverage that, start designing different habits that are aligned with who you want to become. So again, I think habits work great in sets of threes. I do very simply print out those calendars. It's like Google blank calendar, print it out, stick it on your wall, put a marker on it, type it, divide every day into 4 squares, put a little letter for each of the days or each of the habits, and my accountability partner on the 4th square. And that's my tracking system. So those are sort of the mechanics of what I've built. You also don't want to kind of overdo the difficulty level in the beginning. I think by and large, what matters most is momentum. Yeah. And I think, again, I'm thinking of BJ Fogg because he's so brilliantly nailed this one with tiny habits. Yes. But what matters is early success, is small wins. And I think what I'm hearing you say, Jenny, is when you see it on the back end and you see like, oh, wow, you did a lot in 2019. It does feel like that, but it didn't throughout. It felt very incremental and very kind of small. And it, of course, did grow, but that's the nature of habits. They grow in that way. But the overall orientation is I'm trying to keep this pretty simple and not kind of overdo it. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome tip.
So start with habits. That's where I would go. There's other ways to increase that neuroplasticity as well, but I would start with mini habits.
Yeah. Right. Luke, how about you?
Yeah, I'd just echo that around the kind of the tiny habits, micro habits. I can just say I've meditated for many, many years, but it was only when a few years ago that I set a goal for myself, no longer to try to sit down and meditate twice a day for 15 to 20 minutes each time. I set a goal to meditate for 5 minutes a day, because I knew that if I sat for 5 minutes, I'd sit for 20. Right. It was the first 5 minutes that were the hard part. And so in creating just that micro commitment, as it were, that created the small wins, which created the energy, the momentum that created the habit, exactly, James, to the way you're describing. And so that to me was just a kind of a practical thing that I've done. And I'm trying to repeat that, where I'm looking at just what are those next 1 or 2 habits that I can take on at a given time. What's the start of that habit? So not the hour of reading every day, but maybe it's the 5 pages of reading every day on a particular topic, or a conversation or a question that I want to be able to pose to the relationships that are nearest and dearest to me on a daily basis. That can be for a 5-minute conversation that is not about how was your day, that is not about what was on the news or how are the kids or the things we already talk about all the time. And so it can be just little tiny things along those lines. I think the other thing, a few different, ways that I've approached this, I think as I've gone into looking at this next year for myself and the way that I'm thinking about my project, I'm designing it more as a waterfall than a project plan. And what I mean by that is that I'm getting very clear on what's the next phase of this that I want to enter, and roughly how will I know when I'm nearing either the end or the graduation point, I guess you could say, of that particular phase. And while I have the ideas for phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4, I'm writing them in pencil. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing that very intentionally so that I can follow my experience, my intuition as it serves me, as well as just my pure findings, the logical side of me too, to navigate as it goes. It also gives me that sense of freedom. So exactly, Jenny, as you said, it doesn't have that same level of overwhelm, because it's not like this project plan that if I miss my date, I'm off track.
Right.
It's kind of a little bit more fluid in that regard. And I also know that that's something that serves me really well. Couple other things. The other thing that I know, and I'm still actually in the midst of putting this together for this coming year, because I don't yet know exactly what this is going to look like. When I did the year of mindfulness, I knew that being somehow in community and probably a part of a program for that specific year was really critical for me, because I know that when I'm in a program or in a group setting, my level of engagement changes, which is reflective of my level of commitment changes. And so there's not really a program for what I'm doing right now. So I'm looking to kind of create a little bit of maybe that circle that is, they don't even have to have the same project. It's just a circle that can come back to, that's kind of like a home ground, a home base, because of something that, again, James, you mentioned. This whole notion just of social support and social accountability is just what I've found to be fundamental to our success in creating the type of change that we want to create in our lives, because it gives us that feeling of not being alone, of getting the energy when we need that extra support, when we feel like our motivation might be waning a little bit. We've got that group that we can turn to, even if they're not on exactly the same project that we happen to be on. It's still a very trusted circle that we can come back to. And so those are some of the things that I've been thinking about in the way that I'm designing and approaching my next year. But like I said, in that waterfall type of fashion. And this was one other thing that James, actually, I just wanted to loop you back in on, because this is something we had talked about offline, was the importance of what you're finding and what we're both seeing in that capacity for social support and community when it comes to the types of changes that we're undertaking.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm coming to community on the back end of my project, yeah. Meaning you have a little more foresight on this. It is critical, it is critical, of course, because we're deeply social in terms of our wellness, our happiness, our, effectively, when we're not in sociality, if we're not mingling, if don't have good relationships, we get depressed. I mean, it's clear that our body's like, this is really bad, right? And so I do think it's not just the kind of, I think it's not just I guess there's a lot of different things that I think could be beneficial for bringing community into sort of a deep, if there's 5 friends in a city that want to do this together and are gathering once a month, this kind of a thing, and they're meeting monthly and they're exchanging ideas and they're possibly holding each other accountable, but they're also mostly there as support and idea kind of generators for each other. What did you find here? What are you doing here? Like, oh my gosh, this is working for me. What's working for you? Like that type of togetherness inevitably is just going from a motivation and from a momentum perspective. It's just the most amazing fuel, because you you feed off of each other. It's a form of social feedback, right? You keep, and you're in it together. And so, again, my sort of very small attempts at this so far, which I would like to increase, it was my friend Scott, just knowing that he's out there. There's somebody out there that knows about my project,
Right.
and is sort of on that level with me. Of course, I'm putting out a lot of content about this. I have a Facebook group about this that people are welcome to join, this sort of thing. But it's that friendness. It's that level of kind of friend to friend that I think is the level of relationship where this really thrives.
It's funny. I don't know. I'd sort of forgotten this, and so you just kind of triggered it as well. Was that one of very, very early on in kind of my career, I had formed a mastermind group. And it was more of the kind that you just described, James, where it wasn't overly formal. It was relatively informal, but it was a way of us coming together and each of us sharing, here's what we're working on. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what, we're going through, or challenges we're hitting at this time. What different perspectives, resources, help, support can you lend to me? And then everybody kind of getting their chance, so to speak, around that group, around that circle, to be able to give their updates, make their requests, get their support. And it was a very powerful way for us to engage and to be able to move ourselves forward. I guess just one other thing, because I'd seen this question pop in, and then Jenny, I promise I'm going to toss it back to you.
That's all good.
There was a question around how this work, which is largely self-guided and working on self is where a lot of this project seems to be focused. Our projects seem to be focused. But what is the benefit to others? And I just wanted to address that in two ways. First, actually, in the way that we're talking about right now, which is that when you just simply do this with others, there is that communal effect that we've been describing about. There's a social effect of change that really empowers everybody. So even just being in the same environment is very beneficial. But just personally with our own projects, and James, I'm just curious for you as well, of what changes you've seen for the way in which maybe this has changed the way, anything about your relationships, whether that be the personal or professional relationships. For me, I think what I've found is that the more that I've gone on these journeys, and the one that specifically went from mindfulness leading to compassion, the project I'm looking at right now of working on allowing love and to be loved, it's fundamentally changed the way that I'm able to show up and just be with people, if that makes sense to those that are tuning in, is just being present with people and being able to hear them and connect with them without all of the mental chatter and the distractions and the thought loops and everything else that can be going on for us at a given time, and instead to just be there with them. And it's not even about sharing what it is that I've learned most of the time. Most of the time, it's just listening and not even being on your own agenda. But a lot of the work that we're doing clears the way for that to happen. At least that's what I found on the project I've undertaken. And James, I'm curious for you as well, of just what you've found in terms of the cascade of benefits to others. Because honestly, it's the benefit to others that is a major motivation for even why I'm doing some of this.
Yeah, let me get a little personal on this, if that's okay. So my wife gave birth to our son, our second child, 10 days ago.
Time, what is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's all a blur once you have a newborn. February 23rd. And so my relationship with my wife, right, in this process became something. It became, I think, what both of us have always wanted it to be, I think, is the best way to describe it. And what I mean by that is, like, we're connecting with each other so authentically now.
Yeah.
And for me, James, what this means is just saying how I'm feeling instead of like being in tune with my feelings in relationship to my wife, right? The last 2 or 3 years before this, they've been hard-ish years for us, back and forth, for a number of different reasons. And the deep kind of soul-searching, self-reflective, self-growth, and again, to the question's point, self-growth, right? Really trying to deepen and grow my own self, I think has allowed the emergence of this beautiful side of our relationship that up until now, we haven't tapped that depth, right? And to just kind of bring it full circle, the birth of our son is the result of that.
Yeah.
So it is about others. And I think I think it's a false choice sometimes to get stuck in like a me focus versus for others focused. I think when you are working on yourself, you end up indirectly working on others, not that you're trying to change them, but you're trying to be of service to them. So I find this in all the positive psychology research, right? If you're feeling positive emotions, they turn you outward. Quite literally, they make you other-oriented. And negative emotions narrow your focus. They turn you inward. The negative emotions are actually the fuel that get us caught in these sort of self-absorbed anxiety loops and our own problem loops and all these types of things. Whereas positive emotions actually do expand and open us. This is Barbara Fredrickson's research. They open us, right? And it's that opening, I think, to your point, Luke, that is the presence. Like when you're with somebody, you're just open. You're open to how they're showing up. You're just with them, and they feel felt. This is Daniel Siegel's term. They feel felt.
Yes.
And then they feel connection. And once you feel connection, this is why we're here, right? This is what we're all seeking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. I mean, as director of community, I have to comment on community. I mean, community is so pervasive in everything that I do, not just in my professional life, but my personal life. I mean, I have book clubs that I'm a part of, masterminds. I have that app Marco Polo with some girlfriends, and we just send messages back and forth to each other, just sharing our experience. We're not working on a common goal or even similar goals right now, but us sharing our experiences and being seen and holding space for each other just to listen. It's been transformative in that I know that I can always have that space to go back to, and it doesn't matter how long I've been away or if I get stuck. I see myself in them too, and it gives me greater compassion for myself and my experience, and it motivates me to want to be better for myself and for them. So the power of community, I mean, that's one of my soapboxes. So I love that we went there with this final kind of accountability connection piece as a final part of the puzzle that we're all putting together. So thank you both so much for sharing your insights and your own personal wisdom for this space and for anyone who's watching and listening in. I think that diving into these important topics and really grounding them in our experiences is critical for all of us, not just talking about the concepts. We're really living them and connecting through them. So thank you for both showing up vulnerably and authentically. It's really, really important work that you're both doing, that we're all doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
I'd like to invite everyone, if you enjoyed this or want to dive into more content, we have more interviews with Luke and other special guests. You can check in on the interview that James and Luke did before. Just check out oneideaaway.com/podcasts. And that is the best place to start to dive down into all the amazing content that we have. And we also have a community on Facebook, the One Idea Away community, where we're talking about these types of things and connecting. And you can find that by going on Facebook and searching for One Idea Away community. So our live cast today was sponsored by iPEC Coaching. And so accountability partners can be coaches. And also some of us on our journey find out that we want to become coaches or to take our experience to a different level and depth of insight. So if you're interested in learning more about the different pathways that you can take to really stay connected to your purpose and dream and values, we invite you to check out ipeccoaching.com and just put /OIA. And there's some relevant content there that you can learn more about. And also, before investing the time and energy and resources into a full transformational coach program, it makes sense that you might want to, make sure that you're in the right type of place. So we want to invite everyone to immerse yourself in iPEC's Life and Leadership Potentials training. It's a 3-day weekend where you can gain more clarity in your decision-making process. And side note, you could actually bring a guest for free. So that's a pretty sweet deal. Just check out ipeccoaching.com /LPT countdown to learn more about that. And if you want to learn more about James and his work, connect with him, you can check out his website, brainbydesign.com. So thanks again to everyone for tuning in, and we will see you on the next One Idea Away livecast.
Check out iPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com /OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com /community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.